Japan under SCAP, which stands for Supreme Commander Allied Pacific, in other words, Douglas MacArthur, famous American general who was given the task of orchestrating the occupation and rehabilitation of Japan. The two interrelated questions we want to look at in this brief module is what beliefs and ideals informed the American occupation authority in Japan, and to what extent did these ambitions successfully transform Japan's society in the post-war period? Now, it's important to remember that Japan, upon its surrender to the Allied forces in September 1945, had been devastated by the war. Its cities, which were majority constructed from wood and rice paper, had been almost entirely incinerated by an Allied bombing campaign. Much of its infrastructure, of its island economy, had also been destroyed by unrestricted submarine warfare. So the Japanese people were living, in a sense, a ruined economy, desperate to find their next meal. As they awaited the Americans, a people that they had been taught to fear and to hate, they looked at the future with considerable uncertainty. They also needed to keep in mind, although most people were glad, of course, that the fighting was over, that the mayhem, the official hostilities were over, they also had to keep in mind that the surrender was a very near thing. In essence, Hirohito had to launch a coup from above and to force his war government to accept the American surrender after the Nagasaki bombing. So for the Japanese people, it was a period of difficulty and considerable uncertainty as they awaited the arrival of the American troops. They had confronted, the top Western powers in their East Asian war. They had lost this gamble, and now the Americans were coming to set the record straight and to teach the Japanese a lesson. So what you can see on the left is a famous propaganda video that Douglas MacArthur made. And if you look at it carefully and analyze it in the context of Japan 1945, you can figure out some of the dynamics that shaped Douglas MacArthur's decision making. Now, first of all, the fact that this picture was taken at all was a conscious decision by Douglas MacArthur. He had the picture snapped against the Japanese court's objection, and of course was widely publicized and disseminated to the Japanese people. So it was obviously sending a message to them. Now, if you look at it carefully, try to imagine what message perhaps Douglas MacArthur might be sending to the Japanese people, who had waged a war against the United States. They had lost an empire. They, rallied behind the emperor, and they were very uncertain about the future. So, one of the things you can see right away is that the two men are standing side by side. So in the idea of the Japanese past, the emperor was a god that stood above the Japanese people. They hadn't seen his voice. He was, supposed to reign, not rule. He was not human. He was beyond the reach. And one of the things that MacArthur does in this picture is present essentially Hirohito and the new authority as working side by side as partners. He's no longer a god. And not only that, but of course MacArthur is taller than him. So he's transforming Hirohito from a god into essentially a human being and a partner for the reconstruction along with MacArthur. Now, the emperor question was essentially the first dilemma that confronted Douglas MacArthur when he arrived in Japan. And the American advisors were divided on whether Hirohito should be labeled a war criminal, uh, put before a kind of Nuremberg tribunal, and potentially executed. This would send a very strong message who was in charge, and that the Japanese order would be fundamentally different. But there were also people that argued that Japan was very apprehensive. They cherished the emperor, and potentially the emperor could become a partner or a collaborator for building a more liberal Japan. Now, MacArthur hadn't made up his mind. He decided to interview Hirohito. In fact, he had him summoned to his court rather than going to the imperial palace in Kyoto. And quite quickly, MacArthur did a measure of this man, Hirohito, and he decided that he was someone he could work with, and he would be a partner in Japan's peaceful reconstruction. Probably one of the things that contributed to MacArthur's decision to collaborate with Hirohito is the role that Hirohito had played both during the war and to end the war. Hirohito was really not the leading figure. He had, in a way, been pushed aside by Tojo, the control faction, and the Japanese officers that wanted to wage the East Asian War. And him and his family had been very essential in forcing the government to accept the American condition of unconditional surrender. So all of these things, I think, boded well in MacArthur's view that Hirohito would be a valuable partner in rebuilding Japan, that he didn't want to unnecessarily alienate the Japanese people, and he wanted to, at the same time as he was liberalizing Japan, also maintain some of its traditions of the past. Now, there were a lot of other things that went on in this meeting. I won't go into the full detail, but essentially MacArthur and Hirohito hammered out an informal deal where Hirohito and his family would not be held guilty for war crimes. And at the same time, they would support MacArthur in his effort to liberalize the country. At a very broad level, the American idea is that Japan was essentially a fascist state, and that the reason that it had launched the East Asian Wars, it was dominated by militarists, that it had failed to democratize, that its country was too Eastern, and what it really needed was some American-style changes. And that if these liberal reforms could be ushered in, essentially Japan could be made into a democratic society that would be prosperous and not threaten its neighbors. Now, relative to Germany, you might remember that one of the American foci was denazification, that they needed to essentially remove this warlike Prussian traits that had been embedded into German society, and that they needed to democratize the society. That is similar ideas relative to Japan, although certainly most of the Americans that landed with the mission to liberalize Japan didn't have a fundamental, deep cultural understanding of Japanese society, what made it tick, or what made it distinct from American society. In that sense, the American reformers, led by MacArthur, were really superficial in their campaign to democratize society. And although they did succeed in certain ways, they also fundamentally misunderstood the Japanese, and in some ways were outmaneuvered by the old elites that were able to maintain their institutions. But the basic U.S. formula is that what Japan needed to transform its old feudal fascist system was, good style American liberal reforms. These were the roadmap to prosperity that all people needed to adopt in order to enjoy American freedoms and prosperity. Now, one of the foci was, of course, to abolish the secret police. That had been one of the instruments of the, essentially what you could call the ultra-nationalist states. One of the things that the Americans introduced very early was a trade union act. They wanted to strengthen the democratic voices in society that had been essentially silenced by this authoritarian state, the militarists of old Japan. So what the Trade Union Act allowed was that organized labor was able to form unions, they were able to strike, and this gave them a power to challenge the old industrialists that had controlled Japan since the Meiji Revolution. Another major reform that was very controversial, certainly for many Japanese, was essentially establishing rules that allowed full gender equality. Women in Japan, in a certain sense, were enabled to get education much more than most other Asian societies. But what the United States put in was essentially full gender equality, including, of course, the right to vote. Another major emphasis was on education. I won't go into the details of the education law, but essentially trying to transform the curriculum to make the society more sympathetic to democracy, the rule of law, cultivating this kind of democratic culture. Now, while these liberal reforms were pushed through by the Americans, and many Japanese traditionalists tried to prevent them, but in many cases they were forced to acquiesce because the Americans occupied Japan, and they were able to force it through, especially from 45 to 47. There was also this parallel Tokyo War trial, in which members of the old order were held responsible for war crimes, launching the war, death of prisoners and civilians. And Tojo, the head of the government, was executed in these trials. But mostly, the Tokyo War trials was a kind of quiet affair, at least from the Western perspective. The Nuremberg trials had already been held. The Nazis were a lot more known. They were household names. Whereas, really the Americans didn't really understand the Japanese leaders. They were kind of anonymous figures. They were often seen through racist tropes as monkeys or simians. They didn't really have a fundamental understanding. The American public wasn't really interested in the trial. Now, the real capstone to the American liberal reforms is the 1947 Constitution, which is still the Constitution of Japan. And essentially what this did is it set up Japan as a parliamentary democracy for the first time. It also worked to a certain degree to break up the zaibatsu, these military cartels that had essentially dominated the economy. They also essentially demilitarized Japan. Japan had a military strictly for defensive purposes. There were various limits on the development of offensive weapons, or caps on its military budget to prevent it from ever threatening its neighbors again. So with the Constitution passed in 1947, in a way MacArthur's task was completed. He was completely taken away from Japan and given some new tasks. And if we look at this American reform program from a longer point of view, from 45 to 47, we see that it did lay the foundation for a liberal democratic Japan from 1947 on. They had fair and free elections. They had a society of gender equality, very liberal. They didn't threaten their neighbors. In all these ways, it would be a success. On another perspective, Japan was still Japan, and the Americans didn't really understand Japanese culture. And in many ways, even though Japan had a liberal democracy, it didn't function the same way as democracies function in Western United States. So the Liberal Party, which was mostly old Japanese elites, dominated the government for almost 40 years. They never lost an election. There were a lot of close connections, family connections, and in all these ways, Japan revealed its differences. It was not a Western liberal individualistic society the same way. But on the other hand, the United States had not come with a very punitive approach to Japan, which they could have done. They didn't help Japan in terms of providing them aid to rebuild their cities. But in terms of their reforms, as maybe misguided or culturally naive as they may have been, they were well intentioned and they did provide the foundation for a peaceful Japan to emerge in the final analysis. Now, from 1947 to 1951, with the Treaty of San Francisco, that's essentially going to restore Japanese sovereignty and begin the process of evacuating Americans from Japan, although they do keep a few military bases, most notably in Okinawa. There's a major shift in the U.S. policy towards Asia and Japan as well. Largely, this is a reaction to international relations and tensions with the Soviet Union. So in 1945, the United States had approached Japan in its reconstruction from the idea of the necessity to declaw the Japanese military and democratize its society. By 1947, essentially their main concern is fear about communism and the rise of communism in Asia. Even in Japan itself, a lot of these liberal rules, like trade union freedoms, have dramatically strengthened socialist parties inside Japan. So in 1947, the socialists formed a government in Japan. And there's also a very significant increase in communism, particularly in labor unions that threaten the order. So this leads, a lot of the Americans to wonder if they've gone too far in liberalizing Japan, especially with the rise of the Cold War. With the Berlin crisis in East Berlin and Mao Zedong triumphing in the Civil War in Asia, Americans have to kind of recalibrate their expectations and their desires in Asia. Now, from their perspective, the threat is less Japan, and rather the threat to Asia is really communism, which seems to be running over. From this calculus, Japan becomes a critical foothold that anchors American power in Asia. The Philippines, the United States has already left. Japan is really their principal bastion in the Pacific, an Asian continent which is being overrun by communism. So this change in strategic calculation also leads to a change in the U.S. liberal policy to Japan. In particularly, it leads the United States to create essentially an alliance with the old elites that had run the industry and the government and the military during the imperial period. The war trials, the war crimes trials don't end, but in a sense, the Americans lose interest, and many of the old elites are rehabilitated and reintegrated into the system. So after 1948, these old elites, these more right-wing elites, form the Liberal Democratic Party, and they dominate Japan, and they also ensure that Japan remains in the U.S. alliance against communism. This relationship is really cemented during the Korean War, where Japan is absolutely essential as a staging base, and where U.S. spending for the Korean War is also the principal catalyst for Japan's economic recovery. So by 1952, the United States leaves Japan as per the Treaty of San Francisco, and Japan has become essentially one of the Western building block states in the new Western world order and one of the allies against communism, although it doesn't have a major military. So if we're going to draw a few conclusions, one of the things that we see is that Japan is really devastated after World War II, very apprehensive about the future, particularly the coming of the Americans and what they will do with their society, what will be left. They've waged war against the world, they've lost, and now they face a lot of uncertainty about the future. One of the big decisions that General Douglas MacArthur makes is on the question of Hirohito. He decides to make him a partner in the reconstruction, which ends up being, I think, a wise decision in terms of his ability to install various liberal reforms. The Americans are pretty naive about Japan, but they, with the best of intentions, try to democratize and liberalize it. And this is really capstoned in the 1947 Constitution, which is really the bedrock of post-war democratic government in Japan. After 1947, however, America's principal preoccupation comes with the fear of communism and its spread across Asia. So this leads them to look at Japan as a critical bulwark in containing communism, and it also leads them to create an alliance with the old elites that had dominated Imperial Japan to rehabilitate them and to transform them for allies in the future Cold War in Asia.